The following is part of Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series under the Cornell East Asia program. The arguments and viewpoints of this talk belong solely to the speaker. We hope you enjoy. This evening we are here to hear from Roselyn Hsueh, our guest, who comes to us she's now an associate professor at Temple University, where she's been since 2009, yes? But prior to that, did her PhD and her MA and her BA, everything in political science at UC Berkeley. And she has written, recently has a book out from Cornell University Press, China's Regulatory State, A New Strategy for Globalization, is also currently working on a new book in progress, currently titled Micro-Institutional Foundations of Capitalism, looking at China, India, and Russia, right? And so we'll be speaking to us about some of this new research tonight. So please join me in welcoming.
It is my great pleasure to be here at Cornell, for many reasons, in part because it's such a beautiful campus, but also because one of my mentors, Andy Murtha, sitting here in the audience from the government department, is here. And also, as Robin mentioned, my first book, was published by Cornell University Press. So in many ways, I feel like I'm paying respects by coming here to Ithaca. So thank you for having me. So one of the things I would like to do first is, well, first of all, I'll tell you a little bit about the title. It's Globalization and Market Governance, Chinese Capitalism in Comparative Perspective. So indeed, this will be a comparative talk in that I will systematically compare China, India, and Russia. And I'm going to begin the talk with the overarching puzzle. I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivation behind the talk, and then I will dive into my arguments and the empirical data that will be comparative in scope. And I also like to introduce a little bit kind of the cover. I feel like they were actually two different images that I put together. And these two different images, I feel, encapsulates my, the second book project, this research, comparative research quite well, in that here on the left side, we have several books stacked that I actually found in a bookstore in Wangfujing in Beijing. And then here is when I was doing fieldwork in Russia, in Moscow, this is like a bookshelf that I saw in a bookstore in Moscow. And I feel like it encapsulates my research in that in both countries, in both places, they're interested in how the country itself is compared to other large developing countries. And obviously, they're thinking about leaders, whether it's governmental leaders or leaders in civil society. In political economy, when we think about civil society, we think about firms, and we think about interest groups, we think about business associations, and so forth. And so here we have, world leaders, like Gandhi of the past, India, but then we have Xi Jinping, encapsulates what people's imagination of Chinese capitalism. Of course, I hope to do today is to demystify some of these kind of more general perspectives of, well, what defines Chinese capitalism? What defines Russia capitalism or Indian capitalism? On one hand, we have Xi Jinping, and then we have, Jack Ma have come to symbolize what we think represents Chinese capitalism. And then, of course, Putin here. And then, let's not forget, the Washington Consensus and, American liberalism and so forth. So anyway, that's just an image of what I feel encapsulates my research really well. So now I'm going to start with the research puzzle. As we all know, in the 1980s and 1990s, we have these three large developing countries integrating or beginning to open their doors to the outside world and integrate into the international economy. We have the 1978 open door policy in China after the Cultural Revolution and death of Mao, the rise of Deng Xiaoping. And then in Russia, we had Gorbachev coming to the fore, and as we all know, probably from world history in high school actually, the introduction of perestroika and glasnost. And then in India, In the 1980s, there were some of these a balance of payment crises, and leading to the Big Bang liberalization in the 1990s. In the context of all of this, in the kind of the global context, it was a rise of neoliberalism, right? What has come to, in some circles, kind of like the dirty word, right? Associated with the Washington Consensus, the IMF, and the World Bank, pushing countries in the world to open their markets and globalize. These large developing countries, due to some domestic conditions, but also this global context, began to do so as well, starting in the 80s and into the 90s, and now several decades later. But in these countries' globalization, we saw that they actually departed from earlier development trajectories or earlier economic globalizations. And for those of us who study East Asia, we know about the developmental states of East Asia, the state-led development model of East Asia. But what was also well known about the state-led development model of East Asia was that actually they were quite careful in how they restricted and regulated foreign direct investment. It was about indigenous development, right? It was about ISI, import substitution strategy, at one stage, and then moving on to export-oriented industrialization, but all the while protecting the domestic sector, developing the domestic industry, but protecting the domestic sector from foreign influence. But countries that integrated into the international economy in the 80s and beyond during the neoliberal era didn't necessarily have the luxury of doing so. And because of these ideas that were being pushed around the world and pressures to open up their economy. And so we see that China, Russia, and India, these large developing countries, and kind of regional juggernauts of their own, really having a separate trajectory from the East Asian mix. But classically, the East Asian developmental states were also compared to the Latin America newly industrialized countries. That and the divergent picture there was that, in the conventional wisdom anyway, was that Latin America didn't do a very good job restricting foreign direct investment. In fact, they allowed global industry to come in, take over, and that's why Latin America did not do as well. So this kind of like diverging picture between East Asia and Latin America in this earlier era of globalization. Now we have China, Russia, and India, large developing countries globalizing. So the question is, well, if China, India, and Russia are globalizing in a different global context, and they appear to have done something quite different from the East Asian mix. And as you may also recall, not too long ago, we had Xi Jinping at the World Economic Forum being seen, talking about China as, the symbol of globalization, right? He's, up there saying, China globalized and we've done it right, and we've done it our own way. And so in my first book, China's Regulatory State, A New Strategy Toward Globalization, I talk about that, China's unique way of globalizing and what China actually did that was different from other countries. And it's interesting because I don't think I would have necessarily predicted that today China would be seen as the number one globalizer of the world. At the same time, China did truly globalize in a way that the East Asian mix did not. China, on the aggregate level, actually did open up its economy to foreign direct investment. And what I say, though, what I argue in my first book is that you actually have to really open the economy. And for those political scientists out there, probably have heard this idea that we have to open the black box. We have to disaggregate the economy, the macro economy. We have to go to the micro level. We have to open up and disaggregate and see what actually happened. Macro liberalization, but micro level sectoral regulation is what I argued in my first book. And so you might have seen the poster advertising my talk today. The poster has, this, a flag of red, with the symbol of China, and then this maze. And as I became interested in comparing China to other global juggernauts, I realized it's not just opening up the black box in China, but in fact, you have to open up the black box in India and Russia as well. And that actually the framework, the strategic value framework that I came up with in my first book could be of value to looking at these large, complicated economies that we all have stereotypes about. And so today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the complication, the different national level, but also within country level sectoral development trajectories in these countries and how we could look at them across each other. What I want to do though is show you some statistics first. So foreign direct investment as a percentage of GDP in 1980 was indeed quite low in these three large developing countries. We don't have data on Russia, because it was still the Soviet Union. At least, the UNDP and these international organizations don't have that data. But we do for China and India. And if you compare it to, other developing countries, even NICs, we thought the NICs were, very restrictive of FDI. But in 1980, China, India, even more so. But fast forward in 2005, and this is, capturing one point in history, is that we're beginning to see that actually now China, both China excluding Hong Kong, but also China including Hong Kong data, now one of the global leaders in FDI inflows as a percentage of GDP. And in fact, China is the largest recipient of FDI, number 1 and 2 with the United States. And we see that India and Russia have now also been much more open. And so completing this picture that I told you about these countries really globalizing into the international economy. Then we have kind of longitudinal data here. So, I showed you a picture of the snapshot of 1980, and in 2005, certainly, China come on top. But looking at the long view, it's also important because, and especially if we're going to have Xi Jinping, in 2016 claiming China being like the globalizer, then what's interesting to point out is that actually come 2013, FDI as a percentage of GDP, China is actually not on top anymore. Sure, China has globalized, but really, we see that India and Russia are actually quite open as well. So this data both shows the globalization of three countries, but also demystifies if we just pull the longitudinal data out and see it cross-nationally. And this is true for exports of goods and services as percentage of GDP. There are many indicators to how globalized a country is. And exports, as we all know, it's also one of them. And so here, once again, China is not the global leader as we might have expected among the three countries. But yes, all three countries are quite extensive in globalization. Yes. And here is just another indicator of globalization, right? Membership in IO. And then again, not so surprising, right? Open door policy in 1978. And so then we have, China suddenly, becoming a member of many, many international organizations in 1980. And Russia, the numbers for Russia becomes quite high in 92 because why? The collapse of the Soviet Union, right? And with India, more steady numbers because India has been part of the global society community and also international economy a lot longer than these three countries. But yet another indicator of globalization. And we have India as a founding member of WTO from the GATT. China didn't enter the WTO until 2001. And 10 years later, when everyone's kind of looking back and thinking about, has China actually opened its economy since its membership? That's when actually Russia, after some fits and starts, actually entered the WTO in 2011. So we did see, at least on this indicator, a little difference in terms of countries' membership as part of the WTO. But as I show in my first book, just because China became a member of the WTO in 2001 doesn't mean necessarily that all of its sectors are indeed that globalized or that its economy actually opened up to global forces like China committed to do so in WTO entry. Anyway, so all three countries have development outcomes that vary from each other, despite kind of these macro level globalization. And so I'm interested in, well, what is the relationship between globalization and development outcomes? What happens in the middle? What are the causal mechanisms mediating globalization on one hand and development outcomes on the other? And our stereotypical views of, China being, unprecedented development in the last 30, 40 years. Russia being a basket case, since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dismantling of state institutions. Strong state versus weak state. Shock therapy versus gradualism. What's actually explaining what's inside? What are the causal mechanisms linking these development outcomes? And why are these kind of pre-existing conventional wisdoms and arguments not enough or limited in helping us understand this relationship? Because when we open the black box, we do see cross-national differences and importantly, intra-country sectoral differences in pathways to development. And so it requires mobilization of research and development resources and funding, whether it comes from civil society or the state, or a combination of both. There are some technological properties that are just there that all countries will have to confront. But we also have existing organization of institutions that will have path-dependent effects that will explain why certain resources cannot be mobilized by the state or by civil society at any given moment in time. And then most importantly, and what I say actually explains these dominant structures, is that ideas matter and that perceived strategic value matter. We may think that, especially for those of us who are China specialists and who have been looking and following what China has done in terms of sectors and protecting sectors that have application for the national security, for the a contribution to the national technology base, and the competitiveness of the economy, we might think that all countries will closely protect telecommunications. Especially countries that might want to have some management of the dissemination of information. But curiously, because ideas differ and the perception of strategic value differ, we see that actually, in fact, in 1980 or in 1990, these different critical junctures, we see countries like India and Russia, because of their different perception of what is considered strategic, retaining control of certain sectors and opening others that look very different from the other country, despite these common forces of globalization. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about my motivation, but as I've already mentioned, some of it has to do with the findings of my first book. And also this idea that everyone assumes that there is a model to explain transition outcomes. Kind of post-communist transition outcomes, gradualism versus shock therapy, or that developing countries have yet another trajectory. And I make the argument that actually this strategic value framework doesn't just limit us to post-communist transitioning countries, or just limit us to the developing countries' trajectories. Now, obviously, in my selection of cases and my application of my strategic value framework, I'm looking at large developing countries. And that all had market transitions. Even if, obviously India didn't necessarily transition from a communist context to something else, but it did have a socialist economy. But I argue that actually the strategic value framework is a good analytical framework that will let us compare these countries and understand that market governance mediation. And then importantly, and this is something that, right here, will be of interest to some of those of us who are knee deep in some more area studies focus, which is actually one of my dissertation advisors at Berkeley, questioned I think I put critiques, but I really mean questioned the value of even comparing China or looking at China only as a case. China's it's very unique in itself, and unpacking China is already really quite important, and I certainly agree with that as well. But of course, obviously, my research agenda here, I'm going to argue that there are actually findings in China that allows us to then look at other countries in a way that would be actually very helpful and move us forward theoretically and empirically. And then most recently, we have Lily Cai over at MIT making the argument in comparative political studies that actually research done in China, and actually specifically research done in China subnationally and internally to China. So in some sense, following what Kevin O'Brien says is important, which is, China in itself is interesting. But Lily Cai is saying, true, and there are contributions there, but actually we could build comparative politics theory as well by looking at China as a case and the findings of China. We could generalize across and develop comparative politics theory. And then we have here actually Peter Kazenstein and Rudy Sell, and also China scholars, Scott Kennedy and Mary Gallagher, making the argument that, there is something to be said about comparing across cases. And that actually, by doing so, we retain the thick description, we retain and the grounded explanations, but we can also establish some generalizability about how countries grapple and with the forces of globalization, whether to, have stronger state or, fall under the victim of globalization. And obviously, it's a mixed picture. It's not such a zero-sum game. But in fact, though, we do see variation, and it's important. And you don't really see that. You don't see that China isn't just, the symbol of globalization that Xi Jinping claims China is, until you compare China and China's experience to other countries. Okay, so quickly, what's a research design? The research design is a comparative case research. I combine Mill's methods of agreement and difference. It's both longitudinal and cross-sectoral. I look from, I do examine 1980 and beyond data, but specifically the systematic comparison begins in 1990. And the reason I do that is because you do see kind of subsequent or consecutive decades of openness. After post-Tiananmen in China, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then also Big Bang globalization in India. So that's why I begin similar point of departure. The data is based on semi-structured interviews and also on-site visits to China, India, and Russia, and also kind of these kind of global cities, New York, Silicon Valley, and Washington, D.C., interviews with key government of different stakeholders from different levels, industry, company, and then also civil society actors. And as I said, in political economy, we also mean interest groups, business associations, sector associations, foreign delegations, and so forth, consultants, and so forth. And published and unpublished documentary evidence, descriptive statistics, IO surveys, and so forth. What I'm going to show you is how I apply the strategic value framework to understand these national level and sectoral level pathways to development. So again, focus on market governance structures and mediation. Well, what do I actually mean by market governance structures? I mean, in a way, there's so much in market governance, and in fact, different disciplines, different subfields, different works have defined market governance differently. And so here I build on Janusz Kornai, a development economist, in identifying different dimensions that are important when we think about institutional foundations. On one dimension, we have coordination mechanisms. And here, I don't just mean coordination mechanisms by the state. It could be many different types. It could be state coordination, but it could also be market level coordination, or it could be a combination of both. But I see that coordination mechanisms will matter, because they will shape behavior. And also distribution of property rights will matter because they will shape behavior. But it's not one or the other. So what I mean by that is you can have an industry within a country that is mainly dominated by state-owned enterprises, but at the same time be very competitive and quite well integrated into the international economy. Similarly, on the flip side, you could have a distribution of property rights where it's mainly non-state market actors, but not much competition. It could be non-state market actors that dominates a particular industry, monopolies, right? So that's why you can't just look at property rights alone to define market-state relations or to define a country's capitalism. But you can't look at coordination alone. That's why you have to look at both dimensions. And so my definition of market governance incorporates both. Market coordinations matter because it delineates who possesses economic and political authority in which issue areas. And so here we have, kind of more centralized, fragmented, or decentralized and dispersed types. Centralized meaning centralized in the state. Fragmented could be different levels of the state interacting as authority, and decentralized, market actors, but it could be decentralized state actors as well. And dispersed, it could be dispersed across all different actors. We have regulatory, independent regulators, but then the state, certain ministries in certain issue areas come in as being quite important. And so I differentiate these different types of market coordination mechanisms. And then by dominant distribution of property rights, I'm talking about the different types of actors that may dominate. And as we know, especially in market transitioning countries, it's all types. Although the truth is, even in liberal economic environments like the United States, for example, we do see a diversity and variety of property rights. We have, in these large developing countries, we have government shareholders, market stakeholders, mixed ownership types, joint venture partners in stakeholder arrangements, state-owned, state-sponsored enterprises, and figuring out how they're different is actually quite key. And what we find is that what is a state-sponsored enterprise in the Chinese context is different from a state-sponsored enterprise in the Indian context, for example. And some of that has to do with institutional structures and regime type, right? Democracy versus authoritarianism. But I argue that actually some of it is beyond just, regime type. And so here, dizzying sectoral and national paths, right? But the reason I even want to show you this is to say that the complexity, right? It's important to open the black box and demystify our kind of stereotypical views about certain global paths that these countries have taken, because in reality, we see a mix. We have telecoms, we have, kind of the stereotypical Chinese state capitalism in telecoms. The state owns all the carriers, right? China Mobile, China Telecoms, any of you who've been to China, no private players. At the same time, in value-added services, centralized regulation, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology regulates value-added services, but we see variety of property rights. Who do we see? We see, Alibaba. We see, there's a whole Baidu and so forth. And so even within one industry, there's subsector variation, and this is true. So, and then we have the picture of textiles, a less value-added, more labor-intensive industry in China, where it's actually quite decentralized. There's really that much state. There's definitely local state. For sure. Local state actors are an important stakeholder. And we want to recognize the local state actors, but we also want to recognize other stakeholders, include state ones as well as market stakeholders. And when we map this out, we see that this is actually the similar pattern for different reasons in India and in Russia. And obviously, I'm going to talk about what those reasons are in more greater detail. I do want to say that I acknowledge there are existing studies out there in all three countries and also dominant perspectives of what actually explains these countries' market opening and their globalization. I call them common forces of change, and because I acknowledge that there are sectoral economic preferences and the international economy matters. I acknowledge that global rules matter. Asima Sinha, in a recent book, looks at the globalization of textiles in India. And she makes the argument that global norms and markets and international institutions play a very important role in explaining textiles globalization for India. I make the argument that my research design and my strategic value framework allows me to understand why we see variation, not just across countries, but within countries. And once you compare within countries, then we're going to see relative differences in the importance of these common forces of change. But indeed, these are common forces of change. There has been devolution of economic decision power in China, in India, and in Russia. And indeed, bureaucratic politics matter. And in fact, one of the reasons why I look across time, I do a longitudinal study as well across these sectors, is because there are moments, there are key moments and episodes where bureaucratic politics actually play a very important role in explaining governments' response to global financial, economic reverberations and so forth. So I call them common forces of change. Yet, I argue there's still a strategic value logic in these common dominant patterns that we see. And here, I make the argument that the perceived strategic value of a sector to the most important economic decision makers will shape the market governance structures that will come about. And at the moment of reform, at the moment of market liberalization, how sectors are perceived to the government and the most important economic decision makers will explain the direction that they will go. And I'm not going to show all the data for my other the institutional arrangements and the sectoral structures, although I will talk a little bit about them. What I'm going to show is that how this factor of strategic value logic really indeed explain why India let go of telecoms. But the one sector and one group of sectors, small scale, labor intensive sectors, retail oriented sectors that India has retained would be textiles. Why is it that it's textiles that most countries around the world have let go? Because it's not value added. There's no technological applications, at least as a whole industry. But why to India is such an important industry to retain? While let's welcome the foreign direct investors. Let's welcome global market forces in telecoms. Okay, so there are going to be objective factors in understanding strategic value. Application for national security, contribution to the national technology base, contribution to the competitiveness of the rest of the economy, to indigenous industry. But most importantly, and this is the dimension that is key, is that these objective indicators are subjectively understood. Okay? And they're subjectively understood, and we see them play out differently across these economies. And across these economies, that explains the subnational level sectoral variance. But what I do want to point out is that the reason, some case selection rationale here, the reason I apply my argument to telecoms and textiles is because sectoral attributes do matter. And I want to show that, despite these technological properties that don't change across, across different countries, why the subjective understanding of strategic value at the end of the day still explains the dominant patterns. Because I look at telecoms in all three countries, I look at textiles in all three countries. Telecoms, capital intensive, complex interactive technology, producer-driven commodity chain. You would think if we care about development, all countries would want a telecoms industry. an ICT industry, information communications technology. And textiles is important because, for large developing countries such as China and India, large labor force, right? So, look at these labor-intensive, linear technology, buyer-driven commodity chains. And so I control for sectoral continuities and also differences. And for telecoms, I look at across sectors of telecoms in that I look at consumer equipment, but also terminal equipment. So more value-added equipment, but also more consumer-oriented. So really, you see more capital-intensive sectors in telecoms and less. And that's true for textiles too, because on one hand, we have clothing and apparel, but we also have technical and industrial textiles. And that involves actually quite high-tech nanotechnology understandings and so forth. So really you see both capital intensive and less capital intensive in both industries. But these industries allow me to control, to have some controls across these economies. And so here, now explain a little bit on how the strategic value argument then applies to these economies. So we have China on one hand, valuing sectors that have contribution to the national technology base, to national security, and competitiveness of domestic industry. In part because we want to make China great and and powerful in development outcomes, but really also for the political legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. And these are fixations that we see after the Cultural Revolution and also in the post-Tiananmen period. And yes, we have Jiang Zemin and Xi Jinping and Wen Jiabao and Xi Jinping and Hu Jintao, all having kind of their own brand of policy making, whether it's Three Represents or the harmonious society or the China dream and so forth. But one continuity is this idea that despite perhaps different measures of getting at party legitimacy and political stability, that's one continuity that all these different leaders have had towards industrial development. And so we have in China perceived these sectors as being key to the economy. And so these are going to be the sectors that tend to have more state regulation, more centralization, while the government then lets go and devolve economic decision-making, and I mean really let go, to a point where we actually hope that there's more market regulation, more regulation of chemical runoffs and the production of textiles, and so forth, but really let go of sectors that are just not viewed strategic for these ultimate goals about political stability and party legitimacy. And we see this across subsectors in telecoms. We have state-owned carriers. Why? Well, let's control state infrastructure so that we can control information dissemination. This is actually quite important for political stability. If the Chinese government can and needs to and does actually shut down the telecom infrastructure in Tibet and Xinjiang, it will, and it has. And it doesn't have to go and negotiate with private players. That's why it's important to retain the carriers in the hands of the Chinese government. On the other hand, we have value-added service providers that actually is, you see, more of a mixed property rights distribution. Now, you may question, well, but value-added added service providers, the Alibabas and the Baidus and so forth, I mean, they also disseminate information, right? Well, don't forget that value-added service provision runs on top of backbone infrastructure. And if the government has control of backbone infrastructure, you can let go of business scope and market entry in value-added services. Because once you shut off backbone infrastructure, or at least you have management and control of backbone infrastructure, then these other players can't really run their businesses. At the same time, though, after this market opening of foreign direct investment, you see the government re-regulating, and that's the topic of my first book, where the re-regulation is about creating national champions. And what's interesting, and I think my dimension of market governance of property rights comes into play here, is that in the past, national champions tended to mean state-owned enterprises. But in fact, national champions today is not just about state-owned enterprises. It's also about favored domestic private players. And the government could recalibrate market entry and business scope for private domestic actors and foreign direct investors to ensure that national champions are still promoted and prioritized, even at the same time being open to globalization, right? Being open to value-added service providers, foreign ones or domestic ones, private ones entering the economy. And so these different goals, right? We have goals of national security, but national development. These different goals also explain why we see differences across subsectors, even within strategic industries. Here we have, this is a picture of, Huawei and terminal equipment that actually even runs some of the equipment in the United States. Texas has, T-Mobile actually uses Huawei equipment. Of course, we have China Telecoms that is dominant in China, but also in some developing countries that the Chinese government has relationships with. I've done some research and have a World Development article coming out on China and Africa. And of course, being an expert on telecoms, I look at telecom equipment makers and service providers in Africa. And China Telecoms actually has teamed with African service providers in Africa, in part because the government owns, the carriers. They could negotiate these bargains with governments in Africa to trade, infrastructure for market development of Chinese players. So this market governance thing, it has a lot of implications, not just for the development of indigenous industry within country, but also their globalization outside of country. Now, this is the China picture. We have in textiles, I just want to quickly run through the different countries and sectors. We have, on one hand, no central bureaucracy at all. Decentralization, openness towards FDI. I mean, you cannot have a more open sector in textiles. Overproduction, overexpansion, I mean, all the craziness of no regulation happens in textiles and different subsectors of textiles, because the state has decided it's not strategic enough. Yet, this is where the strategic value argument still is important, because in technical textiles and industrial textiles, there is state funding that's still available. Why? Non-woven fiber, synthetic fiber, took China to the moon, take China to the outer space. These are all really high-tech material that the government deems still quite important in these, 5-year plans. In fact, it continues every year. You see some of these kind of idiosyncratic sectors in textiles that still get listed. At the same time, because of decentralization, we do see path dependence. In technical textiles, it's not state-owned technical textile enterprises. A lot of market actors. And as a result, government, does need to interact with these market actors, even to bring, Chinese astronauts to the moon. And in fact, all the textile bureaucracies have been dismantled except the Technical Textiles Association. That's a national level sector association with national level designation. All the other sector associations, they're business organizations, they're the civil society actors. Just like in the United States, they don't have any policy influence. Technical textile associations are still designated national level actors. But get this, because of path dependency, because the ministry was dismantled in '93 and completely just gone on the central level by WTO accession, even the Technical Textiles Association really doesn't have that much policy influence. Now, during WTO negotiations, during agreements, and so forth, China always says, we're beholden to the textile to these associations because they're market actors. But in reality, they don't really have any decision-making authority. Now, I know I don't have much time, so I just want to quickly talk about, run through these India and Russia. So we have infrastructural sectors being quite important because under the Nehru period, we infrastructural sectors like telecoms and so forth, under kind of state socialism, there were some technological sectors that were considered important. And what we see in the post-1990 Big Bang liberalization is that conventional wisdom tells us the entire economy was let go. Wait, actually not true. In telecom services, yes, there's no India telecoms. There's no India mobile. Yet, telecoms equipment completely regulated by the state. They're not competitive. They're not major global actors. And in fact, that's probably one area where India probably should have let go. Because, the bureaucracy is kind of bubbling along, not doing quite well. But they have retained India telecoms equipment because rural infrastructure in the post-independence period was considered strategic and important, especially because they fit into this nationalist imagination of rural development for India. And then, speaking of the nationalist imagination, we have small-scale industry being still considered strategic and important because so much of what rationalized India independence from Great Britain, for example, was about cotton independence, textiles independence from a big bad colonial power, taking production in India and then selling it abroad and not remitting anything back to India. So much of the rationalization for independence was because of the importance of cotton and textiles to the nationalist imagination. We have textiles today being managed by the Ministry of Textiles. How many countries in the world still has a Ministry of Textiles? Not really. And you would think that the Ministry of Textiles would be an important sector for India to globalize because it should be, there should be some global comparative advantage in artisan fabric, artisan textiles, in the labor, the large labor that India has. Yet India is not. It's not a world failure in textiles, but certainly not the global leader that you would expect India to be because of this chokehold on the textile sectors. Now there are variation across sectors. But I just want to really quickly show you that India telecoms completely open. Anyone who's been to India have seen just the dizzying number of players. And they're both foreign players and domestic players. Because India has let go. It's not considered strategic for national imagination of what India stands for. It's not entirely strategic except the equipment sector for the infrastructural aspect of Nehruvian socialism. Because of the chokehold, we see handlooms and power looms, small-scale industry dominant in clothing and apparel. Not that many mills. Now, part of that does have to do with the industrial labor structure. Unions are quite important in India, and so there are a lot of kind of strikes and union conflicts. So that does explain some of the inability to consolidate these small-scale actors. But a big part of it is because these small-scale actors still have Ministry of Textiles as a promoter, supporter, and also sometimes just they're not really doing that much. They're just unwilling to move. On the other hand, we do have, because of Indian entrepreneurism, and there's a whole scholarship on that, we do have some global players in more technical sectors, and Arvind is one of them in advanced materials. And this is where the government actually has benefited from some market forces entering these sectors. But again, the Ministry of Textiles is actually quite an important player even in technical textiles. So India could actually probably be even more of a global leader in these technical sectors, but isn't because of the Ministry of Textiles. We have Russia, where the dominant conventional thinking is collapse of the Soviet Union. They let go of everything. Dismantling of state enterprises, dismantling of state institutions, overnight privatization. In fact, once you uncover and disaggregate and open the black box is that, in fact, that is actually not true. Because of telecommunications, and especially the fixed line telecommunications importance to the military-industrial complex in Russia, and because civilian and military networks were seen as one and the same, even the new leaders under the Russian Federation didn't really quite know what to do with telecoms. And so actually retained fixed line infrastructure. To this day, Russell Telecoms runs fixed line networks. They're trying to modernize, they're working to consolidate and bring in technology, but huge state-owned player in fixed line telecoms. Mobile telecoms, no existing stakeholders in the military-industrial complex, not perceived necessarily as that strategic to the military-industrial complex. So yeah, we indeed did see introduction of competition, not even privatization. Because in the 80s and before that, mobile technology wasn't, in any country, wasn't that important and hadn't actually in fact developed. And so it's not privatization that runs Russia mobile sector. It's an introduction of competition at the dismantling of state institutions after the collapse. Now we have textiles. We would think that Russia would be a global leader in textiles if we go with kind of liberal understandings of what introduction of competition and privatization would tell us, right? All these kind of fruits to development, only if you privatize and liberalize. Textiles was literally the first industry to be privatized and also to introduce competition, even prior to the collapse. As early as the late 70s and the early 1980s, we have Perestroika and Glasnost designating textiles as the industry to liberalize and to privatize. Today, textiles, because it was never really that well integrated into the military-industrial complex, so it didn't really have the high technology roots. It's not high tech at all. It's almost a basket case. Exports and imports from other countries, a lot of black market markets that run retail sectors such as textiles, even though it was one of the earliest sectors to be let go. And so Russia Telecom, central ministry, state-owned fixed line, but lots of openness in mobile equipment. And actually some of these value-added service providers and carriers dominant CIS, so not just Russia, but CIS and also some European markets. Textiles, definitely decentralized, diverse, dominant quasi-state, but unfortunately not well managed at all. The state, hasn't really put in much money, but there's no private investment in Russia textiles either. So quickly, I just want to summarize. And just kind of a reminder of what I've talked about already up front is that globalization and its impact varies. Institutional foundations of market governance matter, and that ideas, institutions, and both country-specific and structural, sectoral characteristics will shape these market governance structures. Market governance structures mediate the relationship between globalization and development, and that's why we see cross-national but also sub-sector or within country variation. And that these path-dependent effects of these dominant patterns that we witness is why we see these varieties of capitalism in developing countries. At least in political science, there's a very, very rich literature on varieties of capitalism for the advanced industrialized countries. And I hope that with my study, which was motivated by my work as a China specialist and first found its grounding in China, now as I apply the strategic value framework to the Russia and India context, that I could contribute to kind of new ways of thinking about varieties of capitalism in the developing world. So thank you.